So what happens is, and this has been going on for years, scientists get people into labs, not just teenagers, older people as well, and they get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time. And what they always discover is when you think you're doing more than one thing at a time, you're not. You're juggling very quickly between tasks, and your consciousness kind of papers over it. You don't realize you're doing it, but you are in fact juggling. And it turns out this juggling comes with a huge cost. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect. When you try and do more than one thing at a time, you will do all the things you're trying to do significantly less competently. You'll make more mistakes. You'll be much less creative. You'll remember less of what you do. And that feels like a small effect when you hear, I think most people listening are going, okay, I get that, but it's a small effect, right? This is a huge effect. One study by Professor Larry Rosen found that if you receive just 8 text messages in an hour, it doesn't sound like very much to anyone under the age of 30 listening, I'm sure, it lowers your brain power for the main thing that you're following by 30%, right? Another study found that people who were chronically interrupted by email and phone calls, their intelligence was lowered by twice the rate that your intelligence is lowered when you get stoned, right? This is a really significant effect. This is why Professor Miller said we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of all this switching between tasks all the time.
Everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the tough task of examining the evidence that our society is losing its ability for prolonged attention, focus and concentration. Now I want to find out what are the main factors leading to this and what we can do to mediate it individually, but also collectively through regulation if necessary, before this becomes an intergenerational problem. And we're also going to be looking at this as yet another symptom, like depression and addiction, of growing up with less and less face-to-face social connection and also less non-focused attention as well. Now, fortunately, our guest today, the New York Times best-selling author Johann Hari, has written about all of this, about depression and addiction, and now in his new book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again, he focuses on the very issue of attention. Now, Johann is a British award-winning author and journalist. His book on addiction, Chasing the Scream, has been adapted into an Oscar-nominated film, The United States versus Billie Holiday. And his second book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression, was shortlisted for an award by the British Medical Association. His TED Talks have been viewed more than 80 million times, and over the past decade, he's written for some of the world's leading newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian and The Spectator, and he's also appeared on NPR, HBO, the Joe Rogan podcast, and the BBC, to name a few. In short, listeners, we are going to be spoiled today by a man with a huge breadth of knowledge and experience in all the most important areas of mental health that we're going to be covering on the show, but with the added bonus of being a professional communicator and natural storyteller. I simply can't wait to get into this, so let's go. Johann Hari, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Freddie. It's lovely to be with you. I'd rather be in Italy where you are than here, but you can't get everything you want in life.
It is pretty gorgeous here, I have to say. Johann, I always like to start talking to my guests about their first conscious thoughts when they were sometimes quite young and that may have had some influence in the rest of your life. Can you remember some of the earliest really big questions that you found yourself pondering about?
It's difficult, isn't it? Given what we know about the science of memory, I think the most interesting aspect of that is that actually, how would I put it? You're sort of retrospectively filtering through the questions you later ask as an adult. So my first conscious memory is when I know how old I was because I was able to figure it out. So my parents had just moved to London. I was a baby. I was 18 or 19 months old. I know this because I can remember standing on there hadn't been a carpet put down in the house yet. And I remember the sensation of my feet being cold. But But in terms of questions I was asking, I mean, I grew up in a family, there was a lot of addiction and madness. And so it's difficult. It's very hard to reconstruct these things, isn't it? Because you look back as an adult knowing what you know now, and you couldn't possibly have known as a child. I suppose my earliest conscious memories are of sort of being very unsettled and sort of trying to figure out why. Yeah, it's a rather depressing earliest memory. Sorry, preferred the cold floor memory than that one. But yeah.
However, there is this question about trying to solve problems, and I think a lot of people come to the sciences wanting to understand stuff, probably solution-led. No.
Well, I think, and just to be clear, I'm not a scientist; I'm a journalist. But although I studied the social sciences at Cambridge, and obviously I interview a lot of scientists and study their work in a lot of detail. But I don't want to present myself as a scientist. I'm not. Well, I think there's a deeper thing than that. It goes deeper than science. I think it's problem solving. There's a line I think about all the time that Rumi, the great Persian poet, wrote. He said, "The wound is where the light enters you." I'm sure Leonard Cohen was thinking about it later, because we know Cohen loved Rumi when he said, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think there's something about woundedness and pain. Sorry, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. It's why I'm a little bit, because it was a suicide in my family recently, and
I'm sorry to hear that.
Obviously, Thank you. I've been reflecting, obviously, on this question, and how would I put it? I mean, you want to be very careful that you never romanticize childhood trauma. Some people are just broken by it, right? But I do think a lot of people I know, and it's when I sort of noticed I'm disproportionately drawn to people who've had traumatic childhoods, and I think there's a thing about, if you go through a traumatic childhood and your problems are not solved for you by the adults in your life, which is what children deserve, some people respond by becoming very good at solving problems, and trying to figure things out, right? At a premature age, they have to learn to solve problems and figure things out. And I think that was certainly the case with me, although I did have some very loving adults in my life. So I think, all my work is about, at some level, there's some mystery here that I want to understand so that we together can solve it, right? But my first book, Chasing the Scream, was about addiction. My second book, Lost Connections, was about depression. And my most recent book, Stolen Focus, is about why so many of us are struggling to focus and pay attention. And I think with each of them, I can't believe it's a coincidence that at a very young age, I had to solve lots of problems in a way that other people my age didn't have to do. And now I spend my life, trying to figure out the solutions to problems. That can't be a coincidence, right? I mean, maybe it is. Some people go through traumatic childhoods and don't become like that. Maybe I would have been like that in any case, but it feels to me like there is a link. And I do think it's that Rumi insight, the wound is where the light enters you. There's a point where, there's another, Ernest Hemingway wrote, not someone I particularly admire actually, but Hemingway as a writer, but Hemingway said about war, war breaks everyone, but afterwards you're strong in all the broken places. And I think that's true of any, it's particularly true of war. Although again, we want to be careful about romanticizing war, but I think that's true of much more than war, right? I think there's a degree to which, pain and suffering can be a point of empathy with the suffering of others. A writer I really do admire, James Baldwin, said the only use for your pain is if it can help you to understand other people's pain. And if it can do that, then it can take you beyond it. Baldwin said it slightly better than that. I've misquoted him there. But so I very deeply believe that as well, that, if I think about the things I'm proudest of in my life, it's been times when I've helped other people. And I'm not sure I would have done that the way that I did if had it not been for those painful things, because those painful things gave me the empathy where I could sort of go, oh yeah, I remember what that feels like. Okay, let's try and think of a solution.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I was thinking of. It's this strange desire to not only solve your own problems, but maybe help a few other people on the way. Now, Johann, we've got so much to cover. I'm going to go straight into it here. The main topic for today, which is something I think most of us can agree on, this attention crisis. Now, your new book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, you lay out all of the reasons and the scientific research on why the length of our attention span and how deeply we can concentrate is shrinking. It's fantastic to read about all these alarm bells that we've been hearing about in the press in a single book. And this is further amplified by your inimically accessible style that marries anecdote and story with rigorous statistical research. So please feel free to unleash some of your wonderful stories today, Johann, as they really help us feel into the data. And it's also why so many of your fans love you. Now, perhaps what sets this book apart from all of this other data we've been getting through the press is that you propose that this hasn't just followed a natural evolution, but that our attention has actually been stolen by cultural and technological changes that are being permitted by our institutions without regulation, despite significant whistles being blown across the social sciences and the big tech world, which we're going to be talking about. Now, we won't have time to get into all of the reasons today, so we'll focus on the elements that are closer to the themes and research we cover on chasing consciousness. But listeners, it really is worth buying the book, Stolen Focus, to let these implications really sink in for you personally and for your family, because otherwise maybe you'll be too busy and distracted to do anything to mediate this stuff. So getting straight into the list of factors now, Johann, let's start with the faster, more multifaceted life that you think leads us to switch constantly between too many tasks. I mean, in fact, you quote research that says multitasking isn't really possible. It's more sort of multi-switching. Can you describe this new dynamic and the contributing factors? I imagine the issue here is as much how long it takes to refine your concentration each time you switch. And even when you find it again, your concentration is kind of superficial because it's ready to be switched again at any moment.
Yeah, so that's a good setup for the book. Thank you. I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus all over the world. Try to understand this. And I learned from them that there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make your attention worse have been increasing. So if anyone listening or watching, if you feel like your attention is getting worse, you're likely not imagining it and it's not your fault. So you just gave a really good example, Freddie, which is what's called task switching. So I learned about this, first of all, I mean, did a lot of reading about it, obviously, but one of the people who really helped me to get to the bottom of this is an incredible man named Professor Earl Miller, who's one of the leading neuroscientists in the world, who I went to interview at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And he said to me, look, there's one thing you've got to understand more than anything else about the human brain. You can only consciously think about one or two things at a time. That's it, right? This is a fundamental limitation of the human brain. The human brain has not significantly changed in 40,000 years. It's not going to change on any time scale any of us are going to see. You can only think about one or two things at a time. But what's happened is we've fallen for a mass delusion. The average American teenager now believes they can follow 6 or 7 forms of media at the same time. So what happens is, and this has been going on for years, scientists get people into labs, not just teenagers, older people as well. And they get them to think they're doing more than one thing at a time. And what they always discover is when you think you're doing more than one thing at a time, you're not. You're juggling very quickly between tasks and your consciousness kind of papers over it. You don't realize you're doing it, but you are in fact juggling. And it turns out this juggling comes with a huge cost. The technical term for it is the switch cost effect. When you try and do more than one thing at a time, you will do all the things you're trying to do significantly less competently. You'll make more mistakes. You'll be much less creative. You'll remember less of what you do. And that feels like a small effect when you hit, I think most people listening will go, okay, I get that, but it's a small effect, right? This is a huge effect. One study by Professor Larry Rosen found that if you receive just 8 text messages in an hour, it doesn't sound like very much to anyone under the age of 30 listening, I'm sure, it lowers your brain power for the main thing that you're following by 30%, right? Another study found that people who were chronically interrupted by email and phone calls, their intelligence was lowered by twice the rate that your intelligence is lowered when you get stoned, right? This is a really significant effect. This is why Professor Miller said we are living in a perfect storm of cognitive degradation as a result of all this switching between tasks all the time.
Now, this rise of multifaceted, sort of high-speed demand on our attention is partly responsible for the rise in stress levels. Can you explain how stress can activate our fight and flight system and how that leads to hypervigilance and what that does to the quality of our concentration?
Yeah, so I remember at the start of COVID, loads of people who didn't have to do the heroic work of medical care and the other essential services saying to me, I'm going to be shut inside for a while. I'm going to finally read War and Peace. I'm going to learn French on Duolingo. And everyone listening, you will have noticed no one read Tolstoy and no one learned French. That in fact, people Googling, how do I get my brain to work, increased by 300%. And I think I was unusually well equipped to understand why that was happening, because before COVID, I'd interviewed an incredible woman named Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris and lots of other people. Dr. Burke-Harris is now the Surgeon General of California, the leading medical figure in the state. She actually just stood down a few days ago. Dr. Burke-Harris explained to me, so she was talking, one of stress, she wasn't talking specifically about COVID, she was talking generally about how stress affects attention. She said, look, imagine one day you're walking down the street and you were attacked by a bear. Just out of the blue, a bear attacks you and you survive. In the weeks and months that follow, something completely involuntary will happen to your attention. You'll find it harder to, say, read a book because a big part of your brain will be scanning the horizon for risk and danger. Something came out of the blue to attack you, so you're going to be scanning for other things that will come out of the blue. Okay, now imagine that you were attacked by a bear again. You would likely go into a state called hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is where you really can't focus on what we think of as deep focus, because your brain is just like, what the fuck is going to come out of the blue next, right? And I remember having a really interesting conversation with Dr. John Giardini, who's an amazing child psychiatrist in Adelaide in Australia, where I interviewed him. He said to me, look, deep focus is a really good strategy when you're safe, right? You'll read a book, you'll learn stuff, you'll grow. Deep focus is a really dumb strategy if you're in danger, right? You'd be a fool to sit at the Battle of the Somme reading Tolstoy. You're going to get shot in the head, right? So we evolved to be able to pay deep attention when we feel safe for very good and obvious reasons, right? When you understand that, you can see why COVID threw off the ability of all of us to pay attention so much. The bear came back. The bear came back 2 times, right? But also, we weren't safe. We weren't safe from the virus. The changes in our lives profoundly upended everything that we thought we knew about the way we live. It upended our sense of the future in really profound and traumatic ways. So you can see, I think, why we would struggle to focus. Now, this also connects with evidence that more kind of normal forms of stress, less extreme forms of stress than a global pandemic also damage attention and focus, which is why obviously most of my book is about the solutions, and it's why we need to look at solutions to stress. And I went to lots of places that had built solutions to a lot of the stress that we're currently experiencing and therefore help to restore our attention.
Well, Johann, if you don't mind, we're going to move on because it is something we've covered on the show. Listeners, if you're interested, the threat psychology with Dr. Stephen Porges and the polyvagal theory. So go back to that episode if you're interested.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting body of work. I actually considered writing about it in the book, but I didn't want the book to be too long, but I do think that's really interesting. He's a fascinating guy, and he's in Indiana, isn't he? He's a really fascinating guy. I like him.
You've touched on it in previous books as well, and we're going to be coming back to that, the need for social connection to create the safety net where people can feel safe to deeply concentrate, among other things. Heal, for example, and rest. These are other important factors. Mm-hmm. But let's get through the main points on this list first, Johann, before we come back to the solutions, because I really want to get that in. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the important theme of smart technologies that are mapping our preferences and manipulating us to stay longer on devices, because it's something we're going to be covering in a devoted show in the next series. And it's also a theme that's been in the press a lot, thanks to the Netflix documentary, A Social Dilemma. I really recommend all of you listeners to go off and watch that if you haven't, and even show it to your kids. I showed it to my 11-year-old. because it presents the info in a really, really accessible way. And I think awareness is going to be 50% of the battle here. Now, for stolen focus, Johann, you interviewed many of the same tech developers who pioneered these technologies and who are now blowing the whistle hard on how these algorithms manipulate our attention habits. Can you give us just a brief summary of how and why these platforms have hijacked our attention and how, in fact, we are the product?
I think the most important thing to communicate to people about this, because is that there is a solution to this. And I think there's an analogy that can really help us to understand the solution, because I think too often this problem is presented in a way that makes people feel like, oh, fucking hell, so we live in the matrix, we're screwed, we're never going to get out of this. And it's really important for people to understand this is a much more specific problem than the invention of the internet or the invention of the smartphone. When I started doing the research for my book, I basically thought the problem here was that I didn't have enough willpower, I wasn't strong enough, and someone invented the smartphone. And actually, I learned the truth is both more complex and more solvable, right? Because we're not all going to join the Amish. We're not going to give up our smartphones, nor should we, right? So I think we're about the same age. How old are you, Freddie?
I'm 44.
Right, so you're very slightly older than me. I'm 42. No, I'm 43 now. God, what am I saying? So we're the same age. So you'll remember, it used to be completely normal all over the world, but when we were kids, the standard form of petrol in Britain was leaded petrol, right? I can remember the smell of it. I can remember my mum putting it in her car. And a bit before our time, it was normal that people painted their homes with leaded paint. And then it was discovered that exposure to lead really damages people's brains. Obviously, if it's in petrol, it gets into the air and then people are breathing it in. And it's particularly disastrous for children's ability to focus and pay attention. So what happened is loads of mothers banded together. A British housewife called Jill Roonette led the campaign in Britain and said, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing, a for-profit company to fuck up our children's brains? Jill Roonette may have been less sweary than me. I doubt she said fuck up, but you know what I mean? And they said, this is outrageous. And it's important to notice what these mothers did not demand. They did not say ban all paint. And they did not say ban all petrol, right? That would have been bonkers. They said ban the specific element that's damaging our kids' ability to focus and pay attention. They succeeded. Lead was banned. As a result, the Centre for Disease Control has calculated that the average child is 3 to 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had we not banned it. So it's a really good example, right? I go through 12 factors in stolen focus that are harming our attention and focus. Here's a great model. You identify something in the environment that's harming people's attention and focus. You band together as a democratic movement to act on the science, and you make the politicians do it. So I think this is a really, obviously, things we can do as individuals, but there are also things we need to do at a bigger level. So we apply this to social media, right? I remember, obviously, I interviewed lots of people in Silicon Valley who'd been at the heart of building the machine that is one of the 12 big factors that's really harming our focus and attention at the moment. And I remember Asa Raskin, who invented a key part of how most websites work, and his dad, Jeff Raskin, actually invented the Apple Macintosh for Steve Jobs. I remember Asa saying to me one day, look, if you want to solve the tech component of this, there's an equivalent to the lead in the lead paint. And it's the current business model for social media. You've just got to ban the current business model. So to understand what the business model is, it's very simple. Anyone watching, open any of your social media apps now, start scrolling, those companies begin to make money, right? Put the app down, their revenue stream disappears. That's it. Their business model is get you to pick up your phone as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. So all of their algorithms...
Engagement's the word they use, isn't it? That's how they...
Exactly. The sweet word they use for it. Exactly. Bit of a euphemism. It means that all of their algorithms, all of their engineering power, all of their AI is geared towards one thing, figuring out how do I get Freddie and his son to pick up his phone as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. That's all they care about in their professional capacity. Just like the head of KFC, all he cares about is, did you eat KFC today? All these companies care about is how often and how long did you scroll? Don't take my word for it. Sean Parker, one of the biggest initial investors in Facebook, said, we designed Facebook to maximally invade people's attention. We knew what we were doing and we did it anyway. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. That's what he says. We now have leaked data from within Facebook that shows they know they're destroying our collective attention and particularly our political attention. So when Asa was saying to me, ban the business model, I was a bit like lots of other people said this to me in Silicon Valley. At first, to be honest, I was a bit like, I couldn't really get my head around it. was like, well, what do you, because I just thought, well, that's how social media has always worked. Isn't that inherent to social media? And they said, no, of course not. And no more than lead was inherent to paint, right? There's an alternative. So I said to them, so let's imagine we do what you're saying. We ban this business model, which Professor Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, right? Let's say we ban that model. What would happen the next day when I open Facebook? Would it just say, sorry, everyone, we've gone fishing? And they said, of course not. What would happen is they would have to move to a different business model. And everyone listening or watching, you have an experience of the two different business models. One is subscription. Okay. We all know how that works. We know, people know how Netflix works. You pay a certain amount. In return, you get access. Well, think about the sewers. Before we had sewers, we had shit in the street. People got cholera and died. So we all pay to build and maintain the sewers, and we all own the sewers together, right? I own the sewers in the cities where I live. You own the sewers where you live. It may be that, like, we want to own the sewage pipes together. We might want to own the information pipes together, because at the moment we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our attention. But whatever the alternative model we choose is, the key thing is to understand is that all the incentives change when you change the business model. At the moment, the more often and the longer you scroll, the more money they make. So everything is designed to achieve those goals. Because, like you said, like you alluded to, Freddie, you're not the customer. You're the product. Your attention is the product they sell to advertisers. They have to figure out the weaknesses in your attention and hack them. But if you're the subscriber or you own it through public ownership, suddenly you become the customer. Suddenly they're not like, how do we hack Freddie's attention in order to keep him scrolling? They're like, oh, what does Freddie want? Turns out Freddie wants to be able to pay attention. Let's design our app to heal his attention, not hack it. Oh, it turns out Freddie wants to meet up with people offline. Because people feel good when they look into each other's eyes, as we've all learned in the last 2 years when we were deprived of it. Okay, let's design our app to facilitate that rather than to undermine it. The technology to exist that is easy. The people I met in Silicon Valley could design it in a week, right? Not Facebook. But we have to get the incentives there. Just like the lead industry was never going to go, you know what, guys, I think we've just made enough money. Let's stop poisoning kids' brains, right? That's not how it works. They had to be made to do it by movement. I argue in the book for all of the 12 factors that are damaging our attention and focus, we have to tackle this at two levels. There are loads of things we can do as individuals to protect and defend our children at a kind of close level, but we also have to band together to take on these forces. Because at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us the whole time and then leaning forward and going, you know what, mate, you might want to learn how to meditate, then you wouldn't scratch so much. And it's like, yeah, I'm passionately in favor of meditation, but we need to stop these people pouring itching powder on us. And it can be done. We can deal with the specific aspects that are harming our attention, but it requires a shift in consciousness. We need to not only ask for individual tweaks are important, and we need to realize we are not medieval peasants begging at the court of King Zuckerberg for a few little crumbs of attention from his table. We are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds, and together we can take them back.
And it's not to be alarmist. It's not that every single feature of Facebook or any other platform is negative. On the contrary, they've been hugely valuable. It's more about making sure that the profit motive, the business model behind that is serving those good, positive elements and not being usurping them, as it were, because we don't want to be too alarmist about this. This isn't about being against smart technologies. It's literally just looking for a healthy balance.
I put it differently. The way big tech wants to frame this is, are you pro-tech or anti-tech, right? Because, of course, who's anti-tech? It would be ridiculous, right? Obviously, there are enormous advantages from the technologies that we've got. That's not the debate. Everyone's pro-tech, pretty much. I mean, there's the Amish. I wish them well, but, there are not many of them. That's not the question. The question is, what tech designed for what purposes in whose interests? We can have all the technology we currently have and have it not designed to deliberately, as they admit, hack and invade our attention, but have it designed to make our lives better, right? To facilitate our needs. At the moment, there's Tristan Harris, who is one of the leading dissidents in Silicon Valley, and I would argue one of the most important voices in the world, has explained. At the moment, there is a profound misalignment between your goals for your life and the goals that these companies have for you, right? Now, what we want to do is get those goals in alignment. We want the technology to be serving your goals and enhancing your life, not serving the goals of hacking you in order to sell you to someone else, right? So in the same way, Jill Roonette, when she was campaigning to get the lead out of lead paint and leaded petrol, was not anti-petrol, and she wasn't anti-paint, right? She was pro-petrol and pro-paint. She wanted ones that wouldn't fuck up people's minds, right? No one would say, think about Michael Pollan, the great food writer, who's a big critic of junk food and the kind of food industry. No one would say Michael Pollan was anti-food. That would be idiotic, right? He's
but
for
Johann,
good food, right?
this brings me to such an important point, which I really wanted to get your opinion on. It's not quite about stolen focus, but it's really relevant to this conversation, this for or against thing, and nothing in between. It's particularly relevant to the sort of social media thing regarding polarity and nuance. So it emerged in 2021 from Facebook whistleblowers that a post that provoked an angry emoji response was prioritized by the algorithms to be shown on timelines 5 times more than one that only got likes. Now, this functionality was created to maximize engagement on the platforms, as we've just discussed, by taking advantage of these emotional reactions. Now, many of the divisive issues that cause these type of reactions, mostly the usual suspects, politics, religions, interpretations of science, social justice, all the stuff we argue about, they're complicated issues that require nuance and synthesis thinking to form a balanced opinion on. But the Twitter 280 character maximum, combined with our triggered emotional reactions leading to that vigilant state we were talking about before, it's led to this new culture of just black and white, with us or against us. This tribalist thinking with just no gray area, no synthesis in between. Now, I think this feeds into a point in the book about, for example, the loss of sustained reading, which you speak about, the loss of the benefits of mind wandering and the benefits of non-focused attention and the interruption of our flow states. These are all things you bring up in the book. Now, we need all of these to lead to a sort of longer term, more nuanced evaluation of the information that we're processing. And as they're lost, we're seeing the opposite dictating the public discourse, which polarizes the issues. It cripples our ability to form a sort of consensus opinion. And it really does sort of slow down this ability for this slower, it completely interrupts this ability for a more nuanced type of cognition. First, tell us a bit about these slower parts of cognition you mentioned in the book, about flow states, about sustained reading. And secondly, do you agree that the loss of these things is feeding into an inability to synthesize all these perspectives and have nuance on these complex issues?
If it's okay, Freddie, I'll answer the second part first and then come to flow.
They're so connected. I had to put them together.
Yeah. So I think it's really important for people to understand this. Of all the things I learned in the book, I put this in the top 4 or 5 that I learned, is that, and I want to stress this is not the only factor, but if you want to understand the profoundly disturbing political unraveling that's been happening over the last 6 or 7 years, almost everywhere in the world, I do think you have to understand this the mechanism that you're alluding to, which is, you mentioned that things that make people angry get promoted more on social media. And I think it's really important to understand why and how we solve that. As we were saying, at the moment, there's a business model that is designed solely to keep people scrolling, right? So all the algorithms are trying to figure out, well, what keeps people scrolling? And those algorithms, and I want to be clear, this was not the intention of anyone at Facebook, TikTok, any of these sites, but those algorithms stumbled upon human psychological truth that's actually been known about for more than 100 years, which is called negativity bias. Negativity bias is very simple. Human beings will stare longer at things that make them angry than things that make them feel good. If you've ever seen a car crash on the motorway, you know exactly what I mean. You stared longer at the car crash than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the street. This is very deep in human nature. 10-week-old babies will stare longer at an angry face than a smiling face. it seems to be, I mean, we can't prove it, but we can prove the negativity bias very clearly. We can't prove the reason why, but it seems to be fairly obvious that it would be in our evolution. Our ancestors who were looking out for anger and danger didn't get eaten, right? Whereas the ones who were just staring at the flowers and the smiley faces were obviously in more danger. It seems to me quite probable. Anyway, whatever the reason is. So you've got, but what happened is a terrible combination of algorithms designed to keep us scrolling and negativity bias, because what those algorithms uncovered is that things that make people angry will keep them staring longer. So let's give them lots more of that. So imagine two teenage girls who go to the same party and leave and go home on the same bus. And one of them does a Facebook status update where they say, I had a really nice time at that party. It was lovely. Everyone looked good. And the other teenage girl goes, Karen was a fucking skank at that party. Her boyfriend's a prick, just goes into a stream of abuse at everyone at the party. The algorithms are scanning the words that make people happy words and angry words. I wonder if it scans for the word skank, probably. And it will put the first update into a few people's feeds. It'll put the second one into loads more people's feeds, right? Now, that is bad enough at the level of the mental health of teenage girls, which we know is getting worse. And Professor Jill Twenge has done very good work on this. But that's being applied to the level of the whole society, right? I don't need to remind everyone exactly what you're saying. We are becoming way more polarized. And this is happening in countries as different as Britain, Brazil, and Burma, right? This is happening everywhere, that we are being more and more polarized. Think about what happened in Brazil. In Brazil, there was an irrelevant, washed up, hateful far-right senator named Jair Bolsanaro, who in debates in the Senate about rape told the female senators they didn't need to worry because they were too ugly to be worthy of being raped, who said he'd rather his son died than came out as gay, who praised torturers during the dictatorship. He was a washed-up, irrelevant figure. And then the YouTube and Facebook algorithms discovered he enraged people. It promoted him into lots of people's feeds. It sent him viral all the time. It wasn't the only thing that happened in Brazil. Lots of things happened. Jair Bolsonaro was elected the president of Brazil. And that night, I was there just before this, that night, his supporters chanted, Facebook, Facebook, Facebook at the election rally, because they knew why this happened, right? And even if that was the only effect of all of these negativity bias algorithms, that would be a catastrophe, because Jair Bolsonaro has accelerated the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, which will accelerate the climate crisis, which will affect every single person listening. And that's by no means the only effect of this, right? So you can see how profoundly dangerous this is. Now, again, if you deal with the business model, you deal with the negativity bias, right? Because the only reason that the algorithms are scanning for negativity bias is to keep people scrolling. If it's enraging, it's engaging, right? But when you move to a subscription or public ownership model, suddenly you can take decisions in the interests of the individual or the society, not the interests of keeping people scrolling in order to enrage them.
Can we come back, Johann, to this idea of nuance and this difficulty of these very sort of short attention spans creating this sort of black and white definition of situations? You know, we all know from scientific papers, you know, to have a well-balanced look at data, you need a very long text, and that text is going to be looking at pros, it's going to be looking at cons, it's going to be looking at this information, it's going to be looking at that bias. You know, that takes a long time for a mind to process and to find this kind of consensus somewhere in the between, where you're holding all of these positions at the same time to kind of come to a sort of more or less decision on your own basis. Do you agree that one of the byproducts of a shortened attention span, and obviously the social media and internet fueling of that through these ever shorter messages that really can't physically contain any level of nuance or synthesis of various different positions just by nature, because you'd need more words for that? Do you think that is making the problem, are these two problems feeding into each other and making things worse? Because I just feel that the whole place of nuance and synthesis is disappearing from culture. And I'm talking in academia as well, not just in the public field.
No, you're absolutely right. This dynamic is poisoning and polarizing everything. And, you know, anyone listening, you can just do a little experiment. Set up a Twitter account and repeatedly tweet, I think this problem in the news today is complex and cannot be solved easily, right? Compare that to doing tweets and then do a different Twitter account and go, I think X politician is a prick and an asshole, and see which one succeeds more. I can tell you in advance. I think you can figure it out too, of course. And you're particularly right about, think about academia. The places that should be holding the ground for ambiguity, contemplation, and complexity are crumbling, right? And you're right that there's a degree to which the shortening attention span leads to ludicrously simplified solutions. Think about two sides of the American political divide. I don't believe these two sides are morally equivalent at all, but think about probably two of the biggest slogans in American politics in the last 5 years: build the wall and abolish the police, right? They're inherently political slogans for extremely short attention spans. You say build the wall as the solution to immigration, illegal immigration across the border. And then you say, okay, what happens when they have a ladder? Silence, right? It literally takes 3 seconds to rebut that. Even if you believe it's a legitimate thing to stop people coming in, it's meaningless, right? You've got 3,000 miles of border and people have ladders. Or think about abolish the police. You say to people say, rightly, the current American policing system is extremely racist and it does all sorts of terrible things. Strongly, I agree. That's why I'm passionately in favor of reforming the police in all sorts of ways that can be done. And in fact, that are being tried in various places and are succeeding. But you say abolish the police, and you say to them, okay, let's say we abolish the police. The day after, if I come home and find someone molesting my child, what do I do? Silence, right? So you can see how, of course, these are slogans designed for people, with no attention span, because if you never get to the next beat in the conversation, or if you get to the next beat in the conversation, people say, oh, my God, cancel this person. Look, he doesn't believe the police. You're in favor of killing George Floyd, right? If you ask what happens, which is obviously ludicrous. So you can see how, there's an element, a big part of what's going on is negativity bias. Another part is all these 12 factors that are shortening attention span lead to, and again, we don't stress there was no golden age in which politics was some wonderful Socratic dialogue. There are some things that are significantly better now than they were in the past, but for sure. But yeah, a society that can't think in complex and nuanced ways can't think clearly. And you see this, people can't listen to each other. I remember at the height of the Brexit campaign, one of the saddest things I saw, a group of people who were in favor of Remain, as I was, and a group of people who were in favor of leaving, were basically having a sort of screaming match in the street. And they're just screaming in each other's faces. And I remember looking at that and thinking, and this is not saying don't take a political position. I was passionately in favor of remaining in the European Union. In other contexts, those people would get on really well in the pub and they'd have a right laugh and they'd really like each other. And we would still disagree, I'm sure, but something's gone wrong when we can't, when we're absolutizing our political differences. We can't talk to each other. We can't listen. We can't understand why people hold different views. We can't empathize with each other's pain and each other's joy. Yeah, this is a profound coarsening. It's not only happening for these two reasons. There's lots of things going on, obviously.
Well, I was going to say it's extremely, and as I say, this is slightly off the topic of Johann's book, but I just thought it was really important to bring it up. And we don't have time to go into it now, listeners, but there's some 3 really important points that Johann brings up in the book. So you must go off and read about them. But I think that they are important to mention, which is the loss of sustained reading, the loss of the benefits of mind wandering, which we know for children, for example, is extremely important for the development of their imagination, their problem-solving skills, and this idea of non-focused attention, which many great scientific geniuses will attest to, that their best ideas came to them when they were wandering along the beach after they'd finished their research, rather than not having any non-focused attention, because any spare moment of your day, you're picking up your phone. Now, we're not going to dwell on that because we've got to move on, but those are hugely important points, and I think they are also relevant to this question of being able to hold a more complex view, being able to hold the opinions of others, at the same time as holding your own and understanding that there is a synthesis approach for the world which contains all of those opinions. You're not going to wipe those opinions out. We've got to find a place for that.
You said one thing there, Freddie, just to pick up on just a super short thing that you said there, I think it's so important about problem solving. Because in a way, I would say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever that thing is. That thing you're proud of requires a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And when focus and attention break down, your ability to achieve your goals breaks down and your ability to solve your problems breaks down. And that's true at an individual level where you can feel it. When you can't pay attention, you feel like you've become a kind of stump of yourself, right? You can sense what you would have been if you've been able to apply yourself, but you feel like you can't get there. But also, that's true at a level of society, right? One of the reasons I think it's not a coincidence that we're having an attention crisis at the same time as we're having a huge crisis in democracy across the world. And we are facing unprecedented trapdoors and tripwires as a species. And if we don't get our superpower back, if we don't learn how to focus again, we're not going to be able to solve those problems.
Okay, well, it's a very, very valid point. Now, unsurprisingly, all of this is showing up in an exponentially increasing diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. Now, Dr. Gabor Mate, who coincidentally, like you, Johann, has written on depression, addiction, and attention deficit, he's concluded that all of these are caused by trauma, and that by treating the root causes through social connection, through the lifestyle choices we're starting to talk about now with these technologies, rather than just treating the symptoms through medication, although obviously that is an important part of the solution, he argues that that's crucial to getting through this attention crisis. Now, Johann, help us here. What exactly is the extent of the explosion of the ADHD diagnosis? And in your opinion, how well is the mental health institution responding?
So, as you know, Gabor's a good friend of mine, and I have a chapter about him in my book.
I didn't know that he was a good friend. And
I love Gabor.
I wanted to find out how much he'd influenced you, because there seems to be a lot of crossover.
Yeah, there's a lot. I spent a lot of time with him in the downtown east side of Vancouver, almost exactly 10 years ago. And we've been friends ever since.
And that book on addiction, listeners, you must go and read. And I highly recommend Gabor Mate's version, book about that, which I believe is called something Friendly Ghosts.
In the realm of, my book about it's called Chasing the Scream, and Gabor's book about it's called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And Gabor has a new book coming out in a few months.
Incredible books on addiction. Highly recommended both.
I think with so there's been an extraordinary explosion in diagnosis of ADHD. In Britain, for every one child who was identified with ADHD when I was 7, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. And there's obviously a very big and complicated debate about what's happening there, whether that's actually just an increase in diagnosis rather than an increase in the problem. And of all the subjects I write about in Style and Focus, ADHD is the one on which the experts I interviewed disagreed the most. So it's the one on which I tread most carefully. But there is certainly a component, a very significant component, that is about trauma. If we think about what we were saying before about hypervigilance, right? So we know, to give an extreme example, we know that sexually abused children, I give the figure in the book, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, that I don't want to say it wrong, there's a study in Japan of this, are enormously more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. And clearly what's happened there is those children are profoundly scared and traumatized. So Dr. Burke Harris, who I mentioned before, did amazing research on this. So she discovered there's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey, which basically asks you how many bad things, it basically studies how many bad things happened to you when you were a child, from neglect to abuse. And she found, I'm pretty sure this is the figure, it's in the book, for every category of childhood trauma you experienced, you were way more likely to be identified as having serious attention problems. And people who'd had 6 categories of childhood trauma were 32.6 times more likely to have an ADHD diagnosis than people who'd had none, which is a staggering figure. Other people have found a big effect, not as big as that. Nadine found the biggest effect. So that's part of what's going on. I think that's one of many things that are going on with the increase in ADHD. Children sleep 85 minutes less than they did a century ago. Sleep is essential for attention and focus. I go into loads of reasons why. In children, lack of sleep manifests usually as mania. The food our children eat has all sorts of things in it that cause attention problems. That's a big factor going on. The diet that we eat is actually damaging the ability of all of us to focus and pay attention. But I think the biggest factor, actually, because most children are not traumatized, although most children do eat badly and do sleep and do sleep much less than they need. And the biggest factor is the huge transformation in childhood that's happened. So I obviously tell this story in the book through the story of one of my heroes, a woman called Lenore Skenazy. Lenore grew up in a suburb of Chicago in the 1960s. And from when she was 5, she used to leave her house on her own and walk to school, which was 15 minutes away, on her own. She would generally bump into the other kids because all the 5-year-olds and everyone older walked to school on their own back then. When they got to school, there was a busy road. So there was a 10-year-old boy whose job was to help the 5-year-olds cross the street, right? And then when school ended at 3:00, Lenore would leave and she'd play with her friends for a few hours completely freely. And then they'd just find their own ways home when they were hungry, right? That is what human childhood looked like for your parents, my parents, actually, pretty much what my childhood looked like.
Playing in the streets, it was
exactly
totally normal.
And then in the space of one generation, that entirely ended. By the time Lenore was a mother herself in the 1990s in Queens, that was it. That was over, right? By 2003, only 10% of American children ever played outdoors without an adult supervising them, ever. And of that 10%, I think they got like an average of 12 minutes a week or something. So basically it ended, right? So childhood, even before COVID, childhood became something that happened behind closed doors under adult supervision. And it turns out that childhood we've lost contains loads of things that are essential for the formation of attention and focus. The first, and I know this is a real no shit Sherlock finding, but exercise, right? Professor Joel Nigg, one of the leading experts on children's attention problems in the world, explained to me, exercise boosts your brain connections. It's the single best thing you can do for children to boost their attention, let them run around, right? We are the first human society ever to try to get children to sit still for 8 hours a day. It's an insane thing to do. And then when they're restless, we punish them by keeping them in the one time we do let them run around, right? Madness. So one element is exercise, but even more than that, Dr. Isabel Benkei, the great Chilean scientist who I interviewed a lot, has shown it's when children play freely that they learn how to deploy their attention. When children are playing with other kids, they learn what they want to pay attention to. They learn how to persuade other kids to pay attention to them. They learn how to take their turn with paying attention to things the other kids want. They learn how to deal with anxiety. Anxiety destroys attention. So you climb the tree, you get a bit scared, you carry on, you make a mistake, you learn from the mistake. And if you have adults standing over kids all the time, they don't learn those skills, right? They just don't learn them. It's like the difference between processed food and food that actually has nutrition in it. Supervised play does not give you the benefits of free play, right? But the reason why Lenore is one of the heroes of the book is not because she identified the problem. That's easy. The reason why Lenore is the hero is because she built the solution. And it's a solution that everyone, I really recommend that you, particularly obviously parents and grandparents, that you pursue. So Lenore, initially having learned all this, just tried to persuade individual parents to let their kids play outside. She would start by saying, what's something that you loved to do when you were a kid that you don't allow your own children to do? And I would just get any parent listening, think about that one. And people would say, I used to play in the woods. They'd name a million things, right? But Lenore quickly realized it didn't work persuading parents at an individual level, because if you're the only parent who lets your child out, they get scared, you look nuts. Often people actually call the police. So what Lenore does, Lenore runs a group called Let Grow. It's letgrow.org. Really recommend everyone go to them. And what Let Grow do is they go to whole schools and whole neighborhoods, and they persuade everyone to give their children increasing levels of independence, building up to letting them play outside on their own. And of all the conversations I had for Stolen Focus, I think the most moving, one of the 2 or 3 most moving, was with a 14-year-old boy in a Let Grow program in Long Island. So I went to a lot of their projects. Mm. And this boy was a big, strong 14-year-old boy. He was taller than me. And I'm not that short. and and until this program had begun 9 months before, he had never been allowed out of his house without an adult, right? His parents wouldn't even let him run around the block. I asked him why, and he said, because they're afraid of all these kidnappings. This is a town where the French bakery is across the street from the olive oil store. And this boy had a level of fear that would be appropriate if he lived in Syria, right? And then this program began, and him and his friends started to play outside. And I asked him, what did you do? And he said, we played ball games at first, and then we went into the woods. He said, even though our cell phones didn't work, we still went. It was to him like a miracle.
That's so,
and I said,
so telling.
And I said, and I said, what did you do in the woods? And he said, we built a fort. And we go and sit there, even though our phones don't work, we sit there and we build things. And maybe this sounds a bit melodramatic, but it really felt that the way the boy spoke and all the people in the Let Go program, almost all, it was like watching a child come to life, right? And I thought about how many children I know who don't get to explore anything except on Fortnite and World of Warcraft. We can hardly be surprised they become obsessed with them, and that's the only place they ever get to express their need to explore. And I remember Lenore was with me that day. And I remember when that boy left, she said to me, think about human history, all of prehistory. We're not meant to use the term prehistory, but you know what I mean. All throughout human history, young people had to go out and explore. They had to map the territory. They had to seek, they had to build. And then in one generation, we took all that away from them. And that boy, given a tiny sliver of freedom, went into the woods and built a fort. Because this is so deep in human nature. And one of the 12 factors that I talk about in Style and Focus that's causing our attention crisis is the psychological and physical confinement of our children. Also in school, which is a different subject we can talk about if you like. If you wanted to design a school system that would screw up children's attention, you would design the one we have, which is not the fault of teachers who never wanted this system. So to me, that's so important. I mean, I feel passionate about all the causes, but I feel especially passionate about this because if children don't develop attention when they're young, they're going to really struggle to develop it when they're older, right? And they're going to be much more vulnerable prey for the technological manipulation that we were talking about and for other problems. So and Let Grow, every school should have a Let Grow program. This costs literally nothing, right? And we were talking about political divisions, how hardened they've become. It's really interesting to me. This is one of those things you can talk to super left-wing people, super right-wing people, and everyone in between. We can all see there's something wrong here. And particularly the COVID restrictions of the last 2 years, whether you're in favor or against, and I was in favor of them, we can all see that locking our children away has profoundly harmed them. Now, you can argue, and I would, that was better than the alternative, which was far more people dying of the virus. But if we can learn one thing from this, if one good thing can come out of this terrible tragedy, it's that, okay, if locking our kids away for the last 2 years has screwed them up, we can begin to see that locking our kids away before that was really harmful as well. And we can begin to give them back a human childhood, because right now our kids don't have a childhood that our ancestors would recognize as a childhood.
And all the data supports what you're saying, doesn't it? Because of everything Gabor's been shouting about for the last 10 years, this social connection question. It comes up in our threat psychology interview with Stephen Porges. It's just that we are wired neurologically to be vigilant because of what Johann spoke about, this sort of propensity to seek out danger more than safety, in the sense that we're more programmed to look out for it. And so this is something that also came up in the conversation with Dr. Ian McGilchrist, is that social connection and connection to nature are just absolutely central to human well-being. How could we be expected not to follow our escapist tendencies, whether that be addictions, whether that be hopping online, anything to escape our pain, unless we have the salve for that, which is the safety that comes from social connection and the sense of belonging that comes from a connection with nature? It sounds so basic and logical, and yet it's become divorced from our modern culture. Do you think that there's an urbanization question, that our human environments have become so different from the place we evolved? Could there be a connection with urban environments?
No, that concedes too much. So I think everything you said is right, but there's actually good evidence. So if you got the two aspects you've just described, social disconnection the evidence that we've had an explosion in loneliness is overwhelming. The evidence that loneliness causes depression is overwhelming. Also, the evidence that human beings, when cut off from the natural environment, are much more likely to become depressed and anxious is also overwhelming. I go through the evidence of both of those in my book about depression, Lost Connections. But the only bit where I disagree is you absolutely can build social connection and connection with the natural world in cities if you build cities right. We're obviously not going to disinvent cities, nor should we. We're not going to put like the Khmer Rouge and just abandon the cities, nor would we want to. So I think you're right. Urbanization, as it has currently happened, has had some of those effects. But there's good evidence on this. Actually, just nature exposure in a park is really profoundly, has an antidepressant effect. Also has an effect on healing people's attention. There's a debate about why. Big debate about why. And absolutely, you can build social connection in cities, and I go through in Lost Connections some amazing programs that do that. So I think in a way it would, you're right, the current species of urbanization is feeding that. In some places, some cities are very good at maintaining green spaces, for example. I think about Swiss cities, for example. You're never very far away from a lovely park in Switzerland, even in the middle of the biggest cities. We need more of that. And we need more social connection. And I talk in the book, obviously, in Lost Connections, particularly about very practical places I went that had restored social connection. But I think if we said it was just urbanization, rather than the current species of urbanization, I know you're not saying that either.
And it's totally related to what you're saying, which is it's not so much urbanization itself, it's the way we have responded fearfully to our children interacting with that urban space that is causing so many problems.
It's a really good way of putting it. And I think also it's interesting because there's a degree to which, and this is true of lots of these causes, or rather the solutions. Obviously, most of the book is about solutions to the attention crisis. Actually, intellectual argument is important, but it only gets you so far. So I remember Lenore saying to me, so Lenore used to say to people, you're frightened your child to be kidnapped. Your child is 3 times more likely to be hit by lightning than be kidnapped, right? So anyone who said, I'm not going to let my child play outside because they'll be hit by lightning, you would regard as literally mad, right? But that doesn't work. It's not. If humans were that good at calculating statistics, no one would play the lottery. And I spend half my time in Las Vegas because I'm writing a book about it. Las Vegas would be empty if people understood odds, right? What works isn't actually, it's important to have the intellectual argument. But what works, Lenore was absolutely right. What really works is showing parents what their kids are capable of. When a child comes home, they've let them out and they're terrified, and the child comes home and the child is bigger because they faced a challenge. They saw a squirrel, they climbed a tree, whatever it is, and they realize, and they get that kind of, that's my boy, that feeling, that's my boy. You've got to demonstrate to people an emotion. It's important you have the evidence behind you, but you've got to demonstrate to people you have the giving a parent that feeling is worth all the statistics in the world, right? Although, of course, the statistics are important and are true and should be. It reminds me a little bit of, there's a quote, apparently it's apocryphal, I can't find any evidence he actually said it, but Winston Churchill is meant to have said this great line where he said, communism is a great theory, they just got the species wrong, it works very well for ants. And in a similar way, whenever people try to offer purely reason-based arguments, I often want to say to them, I would love to be that species, but we're not that species, right? That's not how we work. David Hume famously said, reason is the slave of the passions. It's very, when you think about everything we now know about motivated cognition and so on.
Everybody's got an agenda. Everybody's
exactly. So it's important that what we're communicating, we make sure it is based upon the best evidence. That's really, I'm strongly in favor of that. But to just say, I've given you the facts and the reason, why are you not doing what I tell you is not a wise strategy. Once you know the facts and the reason and you've been absolutely rigorous, then you have to use the most effective techniques possible to communicate to ordinary people. And it's not that ordinary people aren't intelligent at all. These are forms of intelligence, right? Acknowledging an emotional truth is a profound form of intelligence as well. So yeah, I think that Lenore is absolutely right about that. I can't remember if I said the name of the website, but just to reiterate, letgrow.org. Get it into your school. Everyone, get it into your school.
I shall certainly be linking that in the show notes, and feel free, guys, to get in touch with Leonore about that if you're trying to get it into your communities. Now, Johann, we're coming up to the hour, and I don't want to keep you much longer, but you've said several times it's a very solution-led book. We've spoken about some of these programs. We've spoken about the need to get involved with legislation in terms of basically crowbarring these very powerful platforms into making some adjustments to their business model, just as we did with lead paint and a series of other things, asbestos. It's not rocket science, is it? What other solutions do we really want to put out there to give the listeners something to think about before we wrap it up? Anything else that's important to mention?
So I go through loads in the book, and like I said, there's these two levels. There's the individual level and there's the collective level, and we've got to pursue both. But I'll give an example, because you mentioned flow earlier, but we didn't go into it. I'll give an example of something that at an individual level I really recommend people try. So let's think about flow. Everyone listening will have experienced a flow state, even if they don't know the term. So a flow state is when you're doing something that is really meaningful to you, and you just get into it, and you get into the zone, and your sense of time falls away, your sense of ego falls away. The way one rock climber put it is, it's flow is when you feel like you are the rock you're climbing. And different people get into flow doing different things, right? For some people, it's making bagels. For some people, it's brain surgery. For me, it would be writing. And flow is really important for thinking about attention, because flow is both the deepest form of attention that humans can provide. And once you get into a flow state, it's the easiest form of attention to provide. It's not like memorizing facts for an exam. You're not like, oh God, how do I do this? It's like a gusher of attention that exists inside all of us. So obviously I wanted to understand, if this is a gusher of attention that exists in all of us, where do we drill to get it? So I went to go and interview Professor Mahali Csikszentmihalyi at Claremont in California. I think it was the last interview he ever did, because sadly he died shortly afterwards. And Professor Csikszentmihalyi was the leading expert in the world on flow. He's the man who coined the phrase flow states in the 60s. He studied this for more than 50 years. And obviously I talked to him about lots of things, but I think for anyone listening who wants to maximize their chances of getting into flow state, there's no guarantee, but you want to maximize your chances. I took from his work, there's 3 big things that you can do. So firstly, you've got to narrow down your goals to one thing for a while. I want to paint this canvas. I want to write this chapter, whatever it might. I want to climb this rock, whatever it might be. And you've got to set aside all your other goals for a while. If you're switching, you won't get into flow. Secondly, you've got to choose a goal that is meaningful to you. Attention slips and slides off things that aren't meaningful to you, right? A frog will pay more attention to a fly than a stone, because the fly is meaningful to the frog. So it's got to be something that's meaningful. So for you, it might be painting. If I try to paint, it looks like a child has vomited on the canvas. That's just not going to work for me, right? So you've got to have one that's meaningful to you. And thirdly, and this seems counterintuitive, you should choose a goal that is at the edge of your abilities, at the edge of your comfort zone. So let's say that you're a medium talent rock climber. You don't want to just try and climb over your garden wall. It's too easy. It won't get you into flow. Equally, you don't want to suddenly try and climb Mount Kilimanjaro. That's going to be way too much. You're going to be overwhelmed. What you want to do is climb a slightly higher and harder rock face than the one you climbed last time. So if you do these 3 things, you narrow down to one goal, you make sure it's a meaningful goal, you choose one at the edge of your comfort zone, but not beyond it, you hugely maximize your chances of getting into a flow state. And I know when I started working on the book and my own attention was fraying, I would go into a sort of negative spiral. I would kind of go, oh, what's wrong with you? You don't have any willpower. You're just weak. Why aren't you strong enough? Now I don't do that. Now I do lots of other things, and I go through lots of them in the book. But one of them is, I'm like, okay, you're struggling to focus. How can you create the conditions for a flow state, right? Okay, refocus on doing those things. Now, I want to also stress, it's really important to have that collective level, because at the moment, we live in a society and culture where lots of people can't create those conditions. I'll give you a very quick example, because it leads to a collective solution. In France in 2018, they were having a huge crisis in what they called le burnout, which I don't think I need to translate.
Le burnout,
the French government, you got it. And the French government under pressure from trade unions, set up a government inquiry led by Bruno Metling, who's the head of Orange, one of their biggest telecoms companies, and just said, look, figure out what the hell's going on. And Bruno Metling discovered that 35% of French workers felt they could never unplug, stop checking their email, turn off their phone, because their boss could message them at any time of the day or night. And if they didn't answer, they could be in trouble, right? I remember when we were kids, the only people who were on call were the prime minister and doctors weren't on call all the time, right? Now, almost half the economy is on call all the time. So I can give all those people lovely self-help lectures about narrow down your goals, sleep more, and go through, lower your stress levels. I can go through loads of that. It's an insult to them, right? They can't do it in the current situation we're in. So huge pressure from labor unions, having identified this problem. And it's really important to understand, if French workers were not organized and weren't banding together, this would never have happened. The French government introduced the solution. It's very simple. It's called the right to disconnect. It gives every French worker two rights. The first right is your work hours must be legally defined in your contract. And secondly, unless you're being paid overtime, you have the legal right to not have to answer your phone or answer your email once your work hours are finished. So it's restoring what our parents had, right? Just the idea of work hours, which have in fact disappeared for lots of people. Now you can see how that's a collective change that frees people up to make the individual changes. You can see how everyone in France now went to Paris, interviewed people about this. Just before I was there, Rentokil, the pest control company, was fined 70,000 euros for trying to get one worker to answer his email an hour after he left work, right? You can see how that's a collective struggle that freed people up to make the individual changes that they need to make.
And it's a beautiful example of how legislation, marries with personal responsibility, and legislation that is not coupled with that is never going to work. And equally, putting it all onto the individual is never going to work, especially if the large tech platforms with, much greater resources to be doing the opposite are going to be left free.
Tristan Harris, who you mentioned before, who runs the Center for Humane Technology and used to be at the heart of Google and has become this leading dissident. He says, look, you can try having self-control, but every time you do, there's 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen trying to undermine your self-control, which is why we've got to change the system. This is a structural, systemic problem. It's happening to most, if not all of us. And we have to deal with those deep systemic factors, as well as doing lots of individual things that I'm passionately in favor of too.
Well, Johann, I can't help but run this quickly, this one of my little theories past you.
Sure.
I've got this theory that the social connection solution, which we're seeing making such inroads, Gabor Mate is definitely one of the champions of this approach, and we're seeing it now with his new documentary, The Wisdom of Trauma. It's really, really coming out how powerful the social connection solution is. So I've got this little theory, which is that if we were able to bring up the next few generations in a socially connected way where all of this was being honored, then we might get the kind of CEOs and the kind of people making these decisions would have a totally different approach, because they would, in a humanitarian sense, they wouldn't be dissociated. They wouldn't be looking to escape themselves through their businesses or through these wonderful profit margins or whatever it is that does it for them. They would, on the contrary, say, I'm not comfortable to sit in this kind of policy. And that applies to institutions and not just companies. I'm not comfortable to sit in this policy and to sit in these companies making these decisions. And they would literally just leave their job and do what Tristan's done, which is to set up an alternative. What do you think? Do you think we could see a world, 20, 30 years in the future, a couple of generations of really socially connected, respected children growing up to run the world in this way? Do you think it might change?
I think you're absolutely right to want to raise children in ways that will create psychologically healthy adults. And I think that's an important component of the solution. I would also say, though, that I think the if that was the only, I know this is not what you're saying, if that was the only way we thought about it, I think that's only part of the picture, because at the moment we have a dysfunctional system. And even psychologically healthy people who enter that system become dysfunctional, right? So, let's imagine that tomorrow, all the social media companies were suddenly run by really, really nice people, right? And actually, I have no reason to believe that they're not, that they're particularly unpleasant, even people who currently run them. It would be irrelevant because they're corporations with shareholders and boards on the company. So say tomorrow Mark Zuckerberg Zuckerberg owns so much of Facebook, that's not a good analogy. Let's say tomorrow Jack Dorsey's replacement, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, that's the head of Twitter, let's say he had an epiphany and decided he wanted to do all these good things and change Twitter. The shareholders would just get rid of him, and the company would just get rid of him. That's why you have to have, and they would replace him with someone who would do the terrible things they're currently doing. So what you have to have is regulation on those companies, individual epiphanies by individual people within a dysfunctional system. Now that they can leave and then become part of the movement to regulate these companies, and that is in fact happening with lots of people in Silicon Valley, and that is incredibly helpful because they have a great authority to do that. There's an enormous case for what you're saying. We want to raise children in socially connected environments where their needs are met. And it's certainly the case that children raised in those environments will be more psychologically healthy and go on to do less harm across the board.
There's another problem here, Johann, while we're on it, which is something that I thought was beautifully represented in I think it was a 1990s documentary, The Corporation, which talks about the history of the corporation.
Yeah, I love that. I've interviewed the guy who made it. Yeah, it
was a brilliant documentary, and it's still valid today. And he, of course, is arguing there that the big mistake was when corporations were allowed to become legal entities, so people, in inverted commas, they became identities themselves, and therefore they could deal as individuals, they could be legally represented as individuals, but unfortunately it also meant they could take responsibility as individuals, which of course you can't put a piece of paper in prison and have any sort of consequences of that. I can't help but think that here we have a classic example of where, Tristan at Google, other people blowing whistles at Facebook, they do all the box ticking. Oh, yes, let's open an inquiry. Let's set up an office. Tristan actually had an office, didn't he? This new head of this at Google for 6 or 8 months. And then he had to leave because he realized no one was listening to him and it wasn't changing anything. There might be some box ticking saying, oh, yeah, this is important. We need to do something. But then they're not actually doing it. Why? Because there is no personal responsibility. This isn't just...
No, I agree with you, but it's not about personal responsibility. It's about social collective responsibility. So it's not that those companies are not... those companies should take individual responsibility. But look, we could have... Let's go back to the lead industry example, right? So of course you could say, should everyone in the lead industry have had an epiphany, realized they were fucking up children's brains and stopped doing it and just shut down their companies? Or, there are some legitimate uses for lead, so not shut it down, but dramatically downscale their companies. Yeah, they should have done. It was immoral what they did. It's terrible. They knew what they were doing. They funded a pseudoscience to deny it. They have moral responsibility. They bear individual responsibility. I would frankly put some of them in prison.
But government institutions shared that responsibility because they weren't on top of it.
But also, the society shares a responsibility, right? In a sense, you can think about it in a top-down way. Should the people at the top of the company have had an epiphany? Should the people at the top of the government have had an epiphany? Yes, of course. But that's almost never how any meaningful change happens. Rebecca Solnit, the wonderful American writer, says, politicians are weather vanes and it's our job to be the weather. Right. Politicians will be as good as the pressure that's put on them, and corporations will be as good as the regulations that are put on them. Sometimes corporations will do good things independent of regulation. Often they do. Many things are invented by corporations that are very good and useful. But in terms of limiting the harm corporations do, sometimes people will have individual epiphanies, and sometimes they'll have enough power in their company to overwhelm the board. I give a great example of that in the book of a guy called Andrew Barnes. Wonderful, wonderful man who owns his own company, Perpetual Guardian, and moved his whole company to a 4-day week, paid them the same as they did for 5 days, but everyone only had to work 4 days. Turned out to lead to an improvement in productivity because stressed and exhausted people can't pay attention. But so every now and then, so Andrew is both A, a wonderful, enlightened person, and B, owned the whole damn company. Or almost.
There's a whole book in there, Johann. You've got to write a book about that one day.
So he can do that, right? But obviously, I have a chapter about him in Stolen Focus, but you're right, there's so much more about him. But, people like Andrew Barnes are very rare, right? And both in terms of having the complete power over the company, that's extremely rare. And when you get to his level, it's extremely rare. And in having this benign epiphany and then putting it into practice and then it paying off, actually.
Well, he had an intuition. There's a lot of research coming out of Scandinavia about a shorter week benefiting the economy and well-being and everything.
Sure. I think, though, the main, how would I put it? If you want this stuff to get better, I think waiting for people at the top to get better, we're going to be fucked, right? I mean, at the moment, we're in a race. On the one hand, all these 12 not all of them, most of the 12 factors that I write about in the book are on course to get worse. Think about Paul Graham, one of the leading investors in Silicon Valley, who says the world will be more addictive in the next 40 years on the current trajectory than it was in the last 40, right? Think about how much more addictive TikTok is to your child than Facebook. Okay, now think about the next crack-like iterations in the metaverse, right? That's one side of the race. These factors are poised to become more invasive. On the other side of that race, you've got to have a movement of all of us saying, no, you don't get to do this to us. No, you don't get to do this to our children. No, this is not a good life. No, this is not what we want. We choose something positive instead. We choose a life where we can focus. We choose a life where we can read books. We choose a life where our children can play outside. We choose depth and focus. And of course, we still want to have lots of technology. And of course, we still want aspects of our life that are speedy and fast, of course. And that's a key part of a good life. But what you are offering is not a good life. And if we don't have the other side of the race, if we don't have all of us saying, fuck no, then they'll just win by default, right? Of course, they're not going to just stop, right?
So let's get practical, Johann. Who should the listeners be writing to? MPs? Are there particular institutions in UK or the US that you recommend listeners to be writing to? What's the best thing?
I wouldn't say writing. Writing to people is good, but at the end of the book, I give a list of over 20 organizations that are fighting on different fronts in the fight to regain attention. So I'd recommend join those groups, right? Email them, ask them what they need, tell them your skills, tell them you want to volunteer. The campaign to restore child. Exactly. From the groups that are taking on the big tech industry, to the groups that are taking on the food industry, to the groups that are rebuilding childhood, and a whole range of other ones, the campaigns for a 4-day week. So these campaigns have already begun. So I would just recommend go through that list, email everyone, find the bit that connects with you and your passion, email them, tell them your skills, tell them what you can do, and be part of the fight, because, we are all the beneficiaries of big collective fights, right? My Swiss grandmother, when she was the age I am now, was not allowed to vote when she was the age I am, right? I'm gay. Just a generation ago, 2 generations ago, I would be put in prison for being gay. Right now, I can get married. Everyone listening, the weekend was a really radical idea until workers banded together and fought for it just over 100 years ago. And, and they won it, right? And for a long time, we had weekends. It's now being eroded again, but we can fight to maintain these, to extend these things. Everyone listening is the beneficiary of some people in the past who fought for something better and prevailed, right? I know we live in a time when people feel powerless and hopeless. That's how these institutions of power want us to feel, right? They want us to feel that we are just broken, manipulable, that all these problems like depression, attention problems, addiction are our fault. It's on you. There's something wrong with you. And of course, there can be individual failings, and I'm strongly in favor of individuals fixing things in their own lives. And I'd go through lots of ways in which we can all do that. But, Krishnamurti, the great Bengali writer, said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society, right? We've got to deal with the factors in our society that are fucking us up. These are not products of nature, right? They're not inevitable. James Williams, I would argue, the leading philosopher of attention in the world, who used to also work at the heart of Google and was so appalled by what they were doing, he quit. He said to me one day, the axe existed for 1.4 million years before anyone thought to put a handle on it. The entire internet has existed for less than 10,000 days. We can deal with this stuff, right? We can put this shit right. This isn't rocket science. Humans have taken on bigger challenges than this. When these forces are challenged, they turn out to be surprisingly weak. Look at what happened exactly a year ago today in Australia. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, I have to stress, not someone I'm politically sympathetic to, but deserves a huge amount of credit for this. So basically, everyone listening will probably know this, but advertising used to go to newspapers and news gathering organizations, and it's overwhelmingly migrated to Facebook. So people go to Facebook to see the news, but they only, but the actual money for news gathering goes to Facebook, who don't gather any news, right? So the Australian, and this is bankrupting newspapers and news gathering across the world, which is disastrous for a democracy. So the Australian government told Facebook they had to give a percentage of their advertising to the media, right? You benefit from people going to your website to see the news gathering organizations. You got to do it. And Facebook went mental. They screamed, they shouted, they actually cut the whole of Australia off from news coverage for a while. And then what happened? Quietly, they gave in because we are much more powerful than them. Our governments are much more powerful than them, right? We can deal with this stuff, but it won't be dealt with unless we deal with it, right? No one's going to come and rescue our attention. No, there's no political messiah coming to save us. The solution will be as good as the one we build together. And we can all see this as a problem. We can see our kids can't focus. We can see that we're struggling to focus. We don't have to tolerate it. We don't have to tolerate it. It doesn't have to be this way. We can get our brains back, but we're going to have to fight for them.
Oh, Johann Hari, what strong and
Oh,
rousing words, just what we need. No, we need it, Johann. We do, because we feel, as you say, we feel so powerless. We feel so under the control of every year that the platform changes its algorithms. We just go with the flow. We don't fight back against that because we're so ingrained in the way these technologies influence us. But it is so important to remind the listeners that this isn't an alarmist thing. This isn't about conservatism. Oh, back in the day when it wasn't like this. This isn't the point. This is very much about saying, let's get the best out of this technology. Let's not let it break what it could be partly responsible for fixing so well in the future and being such a valuable resource for the future. So Johann, just last of all, what's next? I mean, you've landed on the zeitgeist of the moment. I mean, it happened with all of your books so far. You're in a big part of this movement to bring the research into our education, into our parenting, into our institutions. What do you think are the most pressing matters that are grabbing your attention now? You mentioned something about Las Vegas. So another addiction book?
No, I'm working on 2 books that are almost comically contrasting subjects. So there's a series of crimes that have been happening in Las Vegas that I'm not meant to talk about publicly because my publishers will tase me, that I've been investigating for the last 10 years and have now reached a terrible culmination. So I am writing, that will be my next book, and I've written about half of it. And I'm also writing, with this cooperation, a biography of Noam Chomsky, I would argue, probably most important intellectual of the last 50 years.
Wow.
But I will probably be older than Chomsky is now. He's currently 93 by the time I finish, because turns out, getting this right is very complex. And so, there was once an Onion story joking about the idea of Chomsky having a Vegas residency. And I sometimes, I sometimes feel like I'm sort of living out that. I'm sure I'm the only person in... I just got back from Vegas and I'm going to go back again soon. And I was staying at the Luxor, and I was sitting in which is the place that's shaped like a giant pyramid. Although they've tried to rebrand as being less based on ancient Egypt. And I was like, yeah, you're going to have a bit of a problem there because you are, in fact, a pyramid with a sphinx outside. But I was sitting there reading one of Chomsky's books, and I remember thinking this was just like comically mismatched, sitting in the middle of this casino reading Chomsky. I was waiting for someone. But yeah, those are my next 2 projects. I mean, the Chomsky one is a very, very, my projects tend to be very long-term and they take me a long time. But the Chomsky one, I think, will be comically long-term. But also, I meant to say, the other thing my publishers tased me for before we finish, I meant to say, they give me this fucking ridiculous script to read that I can't read out. But I will say, anyone who wants to know where to get the audiobook, the ebook, or the physical book, you can get them pretty much anywhere. But if you go to stolenfocusbook.com, you can also listen there to audio of loads of the experts we've talked about. I meant to say, I think this is a bizarre thing to say. I meant to say you can get it in all good bookshops, but I want to say you can also get them in shit bookshops. It's not like we have a quality test where it's like, you're not a good enough bookshop to stock Stolen Focus. Sorry, mate. So yeah, Anyway, you can get the book anywhere, pretty much.
You've been a good boy, Johann. Well done. You're a good boy.
Okay, I've done my right.
You've ticked the boxes. You're on side.
Exactly.
And it leaves only for me to say, thank you, Johann, for your humanity. Thank you for your compassion. Thank you for your brave, sort of courageous ability to, as a non-specialist, as a non-scientist, wading into this sometimes, perilous territory, where you're willing to put your opinion on the line and you're willing to shout from the parapets. It really does take a certain type of bravery to do that. And for all of us out there, your readers, it's an extreme inspiration to hear the passion with which you bring that humanity, your interest in people and individuals. That really is the stories that make up our culture. And I just want to leave you with that thank you from all of us, because it is extremely useful to have people like you out there, shouting.
Oh, cheers, Freddie. Well, I really enjoyed, and it sounds like an ironic compliment, but thank you for paying so much attention to the book. I really appreciate you engaging with it deeply, and I really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks very much. Hooray.